Hello, everyone. Welcome to our workshop about fighting discrimination against international medical graduates. My name is Vahid Nilforushan, and I would be the chair and one of the speakers in today's workshop. I have the pleasure of having two great speakers, Ms. Deirdre Lake and Ms. Rosemary Pauliak. And I would like to start by asking Deirdre to introduce herself to our audience.
Oh, hi there. So my name is Deirdre Lake, and I'm the Executive Director of the Alberta International Medical Graduate Association. And I've been working with international medical graduates since 2004 and have spent my career integrating newcomers into the workplace and believe in their economic contribution. Thank you.
And now, Ms. Rosemary Pauliak, would you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Hello. I'm a lawyer by profession, and I'm also the president of the Society for Canadians Studying Medicine Abroad. In response to the exclusionary system of access to residency positions for international medical graduates and hence licensing, we formed a research committee where we set out to understand the system, the authority, who operates the system, and the rules and the process, which is a far from transparent process. I'm the chairman of that committee.
Thank you very much, Deirdre and Rosemary. And a brief introduction about myself. I am currently the president of Canadian on Paper Society for Immigrant Physicians Equality. I am an anesthesiologist by training. I was trained in Iran, and I am one of the international medical graduates, or IMGs in short, and one of the complainants in the human rights complaint at BC Human Rights Tribunal. So I would like to start the first presentation, then I will turn over to Deirdre, and then we will finish by Rosemary's presentation. In 1962, my father arrived in Akron, Ohio to start his residency in pediatrics. The program director went to the airport and welcomed him personally. My father started seeing patients the next day. Later, he became the chief resident of that children's hospital, while American residents were working there as well. My story is different than that of my father. No one welcomed me. Barriers have been put up to prevent me from being licensed and practicing my profession. I passed and excelled in all the examinations necessary to be certified as a licentiate of the Medical Council of Canada. I worked in a supervised clinical setting at Vancouver General Hospital, VGH in short, for over 2 years. I was able to impress the local cardiovascular surgeons, cardiologists, family physicians, and nurses I worked with. Dr. Richard Cook, a top cardiovascular surgeon at VGH and UBC, wrote this about me. He has proven himself to be one of the most dedicated physicians I have ever worked with, and always puts patient care as his first priority. Dr. Nilforushan's attention to detail and excellent clinical skills have been responsible for averting major complications in several of our patients. Dr. Joel Price, another top cardiovascular surgeon at VGH and UBC, wrote this: "He is a truly dedicated and capable physician. He is not only a talented clinician who takes excellent care of his patient, he is also a caring physician who takes the time to listen." One of the nurses wrote, "I have never met someone so dedicated and hardworking as you. You are so patient and kind to everyone around you. The staff of CP10, patients, and families were very fortunate to have you around. You go above and beyond every day. I cannot thank you enough for all of your hard work and knowledge you shared." Canada announced a new action plan for faster immigration for 38 high-demand occupations, including specialist physicians, in 2008 when I applied for immigration. Canada has had a huge shortage of anesthesiologists. My application was approved quickly because I was bringing 7 years of training in medicine, 3 years of training in anesthesia, and 13 years of independent clinical experience in anesthesia, critical care, and opioid addiction treatment at the top level. However, the medical establishment has not offered me any programs to assess my knowledge and skills in anesthesia in the last 10 years that I have been here. I have been labeled a threat to the public safety without being assessed and without being given the opportunity to prove my competencies in anesthesia. The real threat is to the public safety is the lack of timely access of patients to operations because of the shortage of anesthesiologists. Unfortunately, the medical establishment is not really concerned about it. If they were, they would have run a program for assessing my competencies and training me if required. The only pathway that has been available to me was redoing residency by applying to residency positions. Despite a significant shortage of anesthesiologists, there are no residency positions in anesthesiology in BC, my home province. I have only been allowed to apply in all of Canada to about 8 out of 127 anesthesiology positions each year, even though I had proven that I was qualified to work. Why? No other reason than because I am an IMG. I stopped applying a few years ago after 5 unsuccessful attempts. I have no more resources to continue this gamble. Without a resident physician job, I cannot be licensed. My 18-year-old son hesitates to seek medical attention whenever he needs to because it reminds him that he will never see his father to practice medicine again. Also, I don't know what to say to my 11-year-old daughter when she asks me why I am not practicing medicine while I am a doctor. It is ironic that Canada accepts as refugees people who are denied the ability to practice their profession by their home country, but denies them their profession when they get here. I am one of the thousands of qualified immigrant or refugee physicians who have been mistreated by this discriminatory and oppressive government policy. It continues because of IMG's silence and government misrepresentation. It is time to act. We have gathered the evidence in support of our claims. Turning a blind eye on our claims would just lead to more harms to immigrant physicians, the public, and the reputation of Canada. As Dr. Jane Philpott once said, there can be a cost to acting on one's principles, but there is a larger cost to abandoning them. I am dedicated to fight the oppression of immigrant physicians who are needed in this country to serve the general public and especially to provide more accessible healthcare to new Canadians in the language and with sensitivity to the culture that is comfortable. Canada and Canadians deserve better, and now is a great opportunity to make a big difference in the lives of present and future generations of Canada. I encourage all of you to support our human rights complaint. For those of you in organizations who see the harm that exclusion brings, consider joining the Human Rights Action as an intervener. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn over to Deidre and to her presentation.
Thank you, Vahid, for your story. What I'm going to do today is the purpose of my presentation is to give you some background of the pathways to licensure and the systemic challenges that IMGs face. So I wanted to give a snapshot of the members that are part of the Alberta International Medical Graduate Association. So currently we have over 1,200 members that that belong to our association. And what I like to do is I like to point out the fact that we do have 78% of our clients are 45 years of age or younger. And so, you know, in essence, they're highly employable and have years of their career to contribute. And another statistic that I like to point out is that 40% of our members have been out of practice for less than 3 years. And this is important to note because as we know, the sooner that someone can access their profession, the more likely they are to be successful. And so therefore, one of our goals and strategies is to try to get people to our associations sooner as opposed to later so that they can learn about the pathways and the steps to licensure and make informed decisions around their career. So what you can see is you can see the top 5 countries of origin and where people are coming from currently, and that sort of gives you an idea of the international medical graduates that make up our membership. So we do have a number from Canada, and those would be Canadians that have studied abroad and referred to as CSAs. And you can see that, you know, the top country of origin are people from Nigeria, where they speak English and are trained in English as well. So, and the majority of the members that we have are coming, you know, from family medicine, but that said, we have a large number of specialists as well. So, and we do also have a career transition program for international medical graduates that are seeking to explore alternative pathways into healthcare and doing a lot of research in that area as well. So in terms of the steps to licensure, so I know that this diagram might be a little bit small, and I do have it in larger portions in the next few slides. But I'm going to I want to look at the preliminary steps of licensure. So basically, when people come to Canada, if they don't meet the direct requirements to go into direct entry, then there are two other pathways in Alberta called the Practice Readiness Assessment route and the route to residency. And so in the Practice Readiness Assessment route, this is a route that only exists in Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. And this has two streams in Alberta. It has a stream for both specialists and it has a stream for general practitioners. And this is important to highlight because in other provinces, there aren't, the only practice readiness assessment route happens to be in general practice or family medicine. So what the college is essentially assessing is whether someone has the postgraduate training and recency of practice in order to go through the practice readiness assessment route. If they don't have this training, then they would be required to redo residency, as Vahid had mentioned, in order to become licensed. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So the first steps, so the preliminary steps that IMGs have to do is they apply through the Medical Council of Canada in a program called Physicians Apply. And so this is where they set up their account, they have their credentials verified and their transcripts and so on source verified. So the initial cost of this, and I bring up the cost because the cost of licensure, is around $10,000. And so it's important to educate, IMGs about the costs as well as the steps and the success rates. So so this is the first step, and then the next step, of course, is to do the Medical Council qualifying exam part 1. And so this is an 8-hour exam, and it basically assesses people's medical knowledge. And the importance of this exam is that basically it demonstrates that someone has the medical knowledge and the decision-making equivalent to a Canadian medical graduate. And another step, and so with our members, we find that it takes about 3 to 6 months for people to successfully pass this exam or to prepare for this exam. And there is a 67% pass rate. And so, I highlight that because that demonstrates that there is time needed to prepare. And there's also supports that are needed, which we offer. And so the other exam that people must do is the IELTS academic version, and they have to score a 7.0 on this exam in all skill areas in one sitting. So for example, if somebody had done this exam and received a 6.5 in their writing, which we often see IMGs do, then if they did the exam again and got a 6.5 in another skill area and then got the 7 in their writing, they're not able to combine their scores. And I think that this is an important thing to highlight because this is certainly one of the challenges that many face. So we have members, for example, that are working successfully as researchers, writing publications, for example, and are struggling to get a 7 in writing. And so the writing tasks, if anyone is familiar with the IELTS, you'll know that one of the writing tasks is an essay, for example, and not reflective of the types of writing tasks that people do either in residency or in practice. So when we did a survey last year of our members who had successfully completed the medical examinations, where communication is also assessed by physician examiners, 60% of them stated that the only thing holding them back from being able to apply for residency was the fact that they couldn't achieve the IELTS score required. So for those who are eligible for the practice readiness assessment route, so for example, if they have 2 years of continuous postgraduate training in family medicine, or they have a minimum of 48 months in a specialty area, then they are able to be considered for the practice readiness assessment route as long as they haven't been out of practice for more than 3 years. And, you know, when I hear Vahid's story, for example, you know, I wish that the practice readiness assessment route had been available sooner, because now for anesthesiologists, for example, like he said, that are in demand, they are able to, some of them are able to go through this practice readiness assessment route and are in fact in practice in Alberta. So just to give you an idea, last year, there were 91 individuals that had been assessed through the practice readiness assessment route, and 15 non-specialists, and this is just of the specialists, and then 5 academic positions that were granted. And so those are individuals that are have been able to complete that assessment and find sponsored positions. So for people who are in family medicine, they have to do a therapeutics decision-making exam, and this is basically to assess that you know, they understand the pharmacological aspects and the management of patients. And then so once they're eligible, then the important thing is being able to find a sponsored position through Alberta Health Services. And the best way to think about the practice readiness assessment route is it was designed to get physicians where physicians are needed. And so you'll see that most of the AHS sponsored positions are in rural communities. And the best way to think about this process is that it is a process that funds the position and not necessarily the physician. So what that means is that if somebody is approved and obtains that position, there is a return of service that is required, and they're not able, like they can't move to another jurisdiction with that license without approval from the college. So for those people who aren't eligible for the practice readiness assessment route, so for example, many general practitioners do 1 year of postgraduate training, whereas in Canada, we have a 2-year postgraduate training assessment, then they would have to apply to residency. So in Alberta, we have what is known an IMG program, and that will assess the applicants in Alberta. So one thing that I want to make clear is that everyone has to do all IMGs applying for residency have to do the NACOSCI. And so the NACOSCI is a costly exam. It's a performance-based exam that has 10 stations. It's high stakes and involves physician examiners and standardized patients whom are actors portraying particular cases. And passing that exam basically demonstrates that one meets the requirements as a Canadian medical graduate does and is eligible to apply for a residency position. So after, however, of passing this exam, it's not over for IMGs, because in Alberta, they then have to proceed to do the exam, which is called the mini multiple interview exam. And this was an exam primarily made for family medicine. And this exam is, again, sort of a station-by-station exam where it looks at the personal attributes. So once the clinical competence and skills have been assessed, which is through the QE1 exam, as well as the NACOSCI, then the MMI exam is really looking at, does this person have the attributes necessary in order to, that we're looking for in our physicians. So it does require an understanding of the underlying values and principles of our Canadian system. And so then the next step in that process is to go through a residency interview. If you're called to an interview and if you're successful in that, then the one thing that I do want to highlight here in Alberta is that there is a mandatory orientation and externship. So the best way that I can kind of describe this is the person has been selected for a residency seat, and then there's this orientation externship that they have to do prior to residency starting on July 1st. And this is kind of a vulnerable position for IMGs to be in, because this is not a program of the university, and therefore when they're in this externship, then this is, they're considered associates of the university. So for example, it was originally established to give IMGs a Canadian exposure and experience so that they could start residency on equal footing as their Canadian medical graduates. However, it has in recent years become sort of like it's arguable whether it's a question of it's a test drive for program directors and programs to test drive their decisions, so to speak, because at the end of June, everyone is then notified as to whether they'll be starting residency in July. And so it's become another form of assessment. And then they will complete the residency program, which can range from 2 years to 5 years, depending on whether they're going into family medicine or a specialty. And then they would challenge the qualifying exams and the certification exams based on their specialty in order to become fully licensed, as Canadian medical graduates do. So this slide is just to show you that there are some similar qualities or requirements in each province, but each province does have different routes and different opportunities for IMGs and different licensing pathways. So one thing that I wanted to highlight here in this slide is I wanted to talk about just the matches for, is just to look at where so once someone goes through residency and the CARMS, which is the Canadian Residency Matching System, just exactly, where IMGs are coming from. And so I'll just let you look at that slide for one moment. And then in terms of who entered postgraduate training programs in Canada, I think that this slide clearly shows the number of Canadian medical graduates that match versus the seats that IMGs take up and others. So the one thing that I wanted to show here is if we look at the 2020 column of this slide, you'll see that 97.3% of Canadian medical graduates match to residency and 83.3% of US medical graduates match. However, only 28.4% of IMGs who interviewed for a residency seat matched. So in 2020, there was 1,433 eligible IMG applicants. Of that number, 1,019 were called for an interview and deemed eligible candidates. And of those, only 289 of them matched. So I hope that this clearly portrays the bottleneck of qualified IMG candidates for the limited number of seats. And so while it has been a positive step, or it's seen as a positive step, to allocate seats to IMG applicants to ensure they have access, I think we now need to question this process and ask ourselves whether this is helping or if this is an example of systemic discrimination and exclusion.
I wanted to add a couple of points in regard to Deidre's presentation in regard to the Practice Ready assessment program for specialists. Unfortunately, there is no such pathway for specialists in BC. There is a pathway in Alberta that Deidre mentioned. Also, there is a pathway in Manitoba. I'm not sure if there are other pathways in other provinces, but still they are not meaningful. When I landed in 2010, I applied to Alberta Practice Ready Assessment Program, and they said I was eligible, but I had to go through 3 to 6 months of clinical assessment, and that required a sponsor or an employer. And there was no sponsor or employer who was willing to recruit an IMG. They were just looking for Canadian graduates in anesthesia. And also in Manitoba, there was almost the same situation. So there are not actually much meaningful. I'm not aware of the current situation in Alberta. I know that Alberta has a better system for IMGs, but I don't know exactly what's the situation right now for specialists. So let's see if Rosemary can join us. So while we are waiting, we would be happy to answer any questions that the audience might have. Let's have a look. The question is, what happens to IMGs who don't get residencies? Didn't an individual in Ontario commit suicide a couple of years ago?
That's a question that, so in my work with IMGs, we have put together a number of supports. You know, we do support IMGs at every step in the process. And, you know, we do know that only a certain percentage, you know, will in fact become successful, which is why it's so essential that they do start that process sooner as opposed to later. So we're in the process of tracking people from year to year and their success rates. Again, there are some exclusionary practices and so on. There is the bottleneck of residency positions, which is, you know, a big issue for us here in Canada. But the other question is we have been looking at AIMGA, what else happens, and we've done a lot of research recently around alternative career pathways. And what we found is that not only are pathways to licensure difficult, but so are the pathways to obtaining an alternative career. And so that also requires support and so on in terms of educating IMGs about what alternative career pathways are in existence and so on. And so there is support on both sides that are required. And I think a lot of employers fail to understand the situation of IMGs and who they are, and sometimes fail to understand why someone would be applying for the job that they are. And so we do a lot of work with employers, for example, to present to them different candidates and talk about them as interested in pursuing alternative careers and why that is. And so we find that there's a lot of education that's needed in this area and definitely much more research. All right, I think Rosemary is back from my understanding, so.
Yeah, Rosemary is back, yeah,
Okay.
And we are going to, move on to Rosemary's presentation.
Thank you very much. Very inopportune time for my internet to go down. The focus of this presentation is to frame the discrimination that IMGs face through a legal lens. And in my presentation, I'll be referring to, I'd just like to start with definitions. When I'm talking about a Canadian, I'm talking about a citizen or a permanent resident of Canada. And when I refer to CMGs, I'm referring to Canadians who are graduates of Canadian and American medical schools. And when I'm referring to IMGs, I'm referring to Canadians who are graduates of international medical schools. So I'd like to start my presentation with the relevant facts. And the first thing you need to know is that only Canadian citizens and permanent residents can compete for residency positions in Canada. Some foreigners, such as Saudi Arabians, can get residency positions by purchasing them. The jobs and licensing opportunity I will be speaking about is for Canadians. So, discrimination fact number one, there are different standards of competence for different Canadians. The resident physicians work in hospitals resident physicians work in hospitals providing care to patients. They've been described as the workhorses of the Canadian medical system. And although they are accountable to a supervisor, they do make life and death decisions from time to time. Obviously, they need to meet a level of competence. So to be deemed competent, an IMG must first of all pass the NACOSCI, as Deidre explained. And as she explained, the NACOSCI determines whether one has the clinical skills necessary to begin work as a resident physician. Secondly, they must pass the MCCQE1. And as she explained, that's the exam that determines whether one has the critical medical knowledge and decision-making ability expected of a graduate of a Canadian medical school. In addition, different provinces have some additional requirements for IMGs. CMGs, on the other hand, so graduates of Canadian American medical schools, do not have to take the NACOSCI. They do not have to prove their clinical skills. They do have to take the MCC QE1 after the competition for residency positions. So IMGs must take these exams before they're allowed to compete. CMGs take the QE1 after they've got their position. 3 to 5% of CMGs fail the MCC QE1 and are free to work as resident physicians nevertheless. It is not surprising that a small number of CMGs fail because Canadian and American medical schools have a policy not to fail students. Foreigners who have to pay to get residency positions in Canada, they're called visa trainees, do not have to take the NACOSCI. So even though they're IMGs, because they're foreigners, even though they're doing the same job, they do not have to take the NACOSCI. In some provinces, they have to pass the MCC QE1. In other provinces, they do. So in Ontario, they have to pass the QE1. In BC, they do not. When all resident physicians do the same job and have the same opportunity to harm, it is hard to explain why there would be different standards, except discrimination, obviously. Discrimination fact number 2. This relates to the opportunity to access mandatory entry-level jobs, which are called resident physician jobs or residency positions. Because immigrants are Canadians, based on fundamental principles of law in Canada, having met the Canadian standard by proving their credentials and passing the requisite exams and assessments, this should make them eligible to compete for all jobs for which they've proven themselves qualified. No, that is not what happens, despite the law. In 2020, there were 3,397 entry-level jobs. These jobs, as I said before, are mandatory condition of licensing. These jobs are segregated by place of education into 2 streams. The establishment calls these 2 streams parallel streams, but there's nothing equal about the 2 streams. In the CMG stream, there are enough jobs for everyone who applies, +1. In the IMG stream, the number of jobs is a small fraction of the number of applicants. Look at the numbers. Clearly, the system privileges one group and marginalizes the other. So, and again, I just like to emphasize, these jobs are prerequisites to licensing. One group of Canadians is virtually guaranteed, the other, most will be shut out. So IMGs are prohibited from applying for 90% of these jobs. Discrimination fact number 3 relates to the opportunity to choose your field of practice. CMGs have the opportunity to work towards becoming any kind of doctor they want. Not so for IMGs. Positions open to IMGs are more than half in family medicine. Most provinces only allow a token number of specialty positions to IMGs, which explains why Vahid was unsuccessful. BC graduates 288 medical students each year, but it offers 294 positions in the CMG stream. So 6 more positions than it graduates. BC has hundreds of British Columbia IMGs who have proven themselves qualified to work as resident physicians, who've passed all the exams, who've proven their credentials, but only 58 positions for these hundreds of IMGs. 52 of 58 of these positions, so 90%, are in family medicine, 3 in internal medicine, 2 in psychiatry, and one in pediatrics. In my province, IMGs are not allowed to subspecialize. So the result of that is only 4 of more than 70 recognized medical disciplines are accessible to IMGs in BC. Some other provinces do allow IMGs to subspecialize, but there is no province in this country which offers IMGs training position in the full palette of disciplines. In other words, immigrant specialists and subspecialists are almost inevitably stripped of their careers. Discrimination fact number 4, limitations on where one can work or live. CMGs can apply for residency jobs in any province. This is in keeping with our mobility rights between provinces, which is enshrined in Section 6 of the Charter of Rights. They are also free to leave the province or leave the country immediately after they finish residency training. This is not true for IMGs. Some provinces restrict residency positions for IMGs to residents of their province only, despite Section 6 of the Charter. In most provinces, if an IMG wants to work as a resident physician, and remember, he generally has no choice if he wants to get licensed and practice in this profession, he must sign what lawyers call an indenture agreement, a debt agreement. In BC, Beverly McLean Alley of the Ministry of Health calls the limitation on mobility of IMGs an opportunity cost. In some provinces, these contracts prohibit IMGs from working in a specified urban area. In other provinces, such as BC, IMGs must work where the Ministry of Health directs them to work. Other discrimination, there are several other discriminations, but I'd like to give you just one more before we move on to the law. IMGs who defy the odds and get a residency position are placed on probation in a number of provinces for a specified period and can be terminated at will without cause. CMGs are not subject to probationary period, not even if they fail the MCCQE1. So even if they've demonstrated and that they do not have or fail to demonstrate that they have the knowledge and decision-making ability expected of a medical graduate, if one is a CMG, they are not on probation. They simply get to work. Stark difference between CMGs and IMGs. Now I'd like to turn to the law. Because regulation of a profession interferes with an individual's ability to make a living, which is a very important matter in anybody's life, the law tries to strike a balance between individual freedom and public safety by establishing limits on regulation. So legal principle number 1, the power to regulate is to be used for the purpose of ensuring public safety by ensuring competence and for no other reason. But in fact, the purpose for which it is used is to ensure that all Canadian medical school graduates get residency physician jobs, irrespective of their level of competence, so that they can be licensed, fully licensed to practice medicine. From the ministry's point of view, the purpose of for which residency training and the standards imposed are used is to create a group of Canadians who can be forced to work in underserviced disciplines and underserviced regions. And it is for this reason that IMGs are not allowed the full palette of available disciplines in medicine. They cannot access the full palette. And similarly, almost all provinces have this return of service, which is the indenture or debt agreement I referred you to earlier. Legal principle number 2, licensing should be available to all that meet the standard of competence. And this doesn't mean that everyone is entitled to get a job as a resident physician. What it means is that if someone meets the standard in law, they should be entitled to compete for those jobs. The facts are clear. There is a double standard, one for CMGs, one for visa trainees, and one for IMGs who are Canadian. As you see, IMGs are subject to a higher standard, and despite meeting a higher standard, IMGs are still prohibited, as I've said several times now, from applying for 90% of resident physician jobs, which are a prerequisite of becoming licensed in medicine. Legal principle number 3, only a regulatory authority empowered by its legislation can set competency standards for access to the profession. A regulator cannot delegate or allow third parties to create standards of competency. The competence standards set by colleges to be considered qualified to compete for residency training across Canada is a medical degree from a school on the World Health Organization list, plus language fluency. It is the universities and ministries of health, both of whom are in a conflict of interest, who impose the QE1, NAC-OSCE, and other provincial assessments for Canadian IMGs, but not necessarily foreign IMGs. That these exams are not imposed on CMGs. Legal principle number 4, to fulfill these principles, regulatory bodies must act fairly and without discrimination, objectively, impartially, and with transparency. But if you look at the access to medicine, which is the next slide, is not consistent with these principles. It segregates, it's not based on competence, it has different tests for different groups, there's a conflict of interest, and it's not transparent. And unfortunately, the public is basically ignorant of the workings of the system. And I would suggest, from the difficulty that we had trying to access the information that would explain the system, that lack of transparency is not an accident. The implications of this system to the public are, first of all, that the public safety is compromised, or at least the standard of care is compromised. Canada is not getting the best physicians. Weak physicians from the right school are not eliminated. Weak graduates are not being eliminated. The prejudice that IMGs are inferior to graduates of Canadian and American schools is harnessed and perpetuated. That is the second implication. The third implication is that most IMGs are excluded from becoming licensed in medicine. They are relegated to driving the proverbial taxi. So on May 4th, 2020, Deputy Prime Minister Freeland said, what is consistent, what the government typically tells us, and the law also tells us. This is Canada, and we don't discriminate on the basis of which country they come from and which country they studied. They are all treated the same and share the same platform once they are Canadian citizens. We don't discriminate. They are Canadians and Canadians only. As you can see from the facts that I presented you, there is discrimination. They are not treated the same. And this disconnect between government statements and government policy influences public perception. So by way of example, on April 6th, in 2020, the Vancouver Sun published a piece, and it was entitled, "Even in a Pandemic, Foreign Doctors Face a System Rigged Against Them." This was an article written by Daphne Bramham. And a comment was posted to that article, and it said, Leak writes, "They are poorly trained and dangerous. Letting them loose now is like letting cats into Australia." And Karen Smith responded, "Great post, Leak. BC government and Canadian governments have valid reasons for what they do to keep us all safe and quality care ensured." What Karen Smith believes and says is consistent with the morality, values, and laws upon which Canadians are raised. And that is that public expectation is that government would not sideline qualified Canadian physicians without valid reasons for the purpose of keeping us all safe. And as we saw from the facts, this is far from reality. When you hear the phrases, quote, credential recognition and quote, public safety, put your antenna up. These are phrases designed to deflect from the fact that thousands of IMGs have been marginalized and sidelined. They are designed to misrepresent the reality that thousands of IMGs across Canada have had their credentials recognized and met the public safety concern, but remain unlicensed. This is to create the illusion that government is doing its best to address the physician shortage, when in fact, the government policy is to limit medical licensing numbers, to ration healthcare, to meet the budget. And it would be one thing, is certainly being concerned about the budget is a function of government that they have to be concerned about. But delegating and relegating a sector of IMGs or Canadians who are IMGs out of licensing and out of their career does not meet the standard of what Canada is supposed to look like. And to deflect from, the other thing that it does, these words do, is deflect from the culture of privilege in medicine, where weaker CMGs are protected from being displaced in job competition by IMGs, who can clearly demonstrate superior competence despite the prejudice they must overcome. So when in the second iteration, after the first round, when in some provinces, the IMGs get to compete against CMGs, in 2019, in this second round, in the provinces that allowed competition between CMGs and IMGs, 57.6% of the residency positions were won by IMGs, and that in the face of prejudice, which demonstrates clearly that the problem is not that IMGs have a competency problem. The problem is that they face systemic discrimination. These words of credential recognition and public safety are dog whistles which justify systemic discrimination by signaling and promoting the perception that IMGs are inferior. If IMGs were truly inferior, there would be no need to prohibit IMGs from competing against CMGs. If CMGs were truly superior in competence, they would win without a prohibition on competition and without infringing on the most fundamental principles of the Canadian Charter of Rights and of human rights. The system has gone unchallenged for more than 25 years because individuals are afraid, and because the public and even the government officials are often ignorant of the facts. The misleading messages of lack of credential recognition and public safety is effective in distracting from the truth and marginalizing those who are oppressed. And because challenging the government is expensive and takes a long time. In summary, Canada has the right to deny applications to immigrate. It has that right. It does not have the legal right to deny Canadians who are immigrants the right to compete for jobs for which they are qualified. It does not have the legal right to subjugate them and marginalize them by forcing them into second-class citizenry with limited opportunity to thrive. It doesn't have the right to deprive them of their careers unless on the basis of competence. So what is being done about this? There are now 2 legal challenges outstanding on this issue. In June of this year, 5 immigrant physicians filed a human rights challenge. It was filed in British Columbia, and it seeks a declaration that the system of licensing in the medical profession discriminates against them on the basis of place of origin, race, and age. The complaint describes the discrimination and the exploitation that immigrant physicians face and demands that systemic discrimination stop, and that IMGs who have established competence be entitled to compete for all resident physician jobs without being forced into contracts restricting their mobility rights under the Charter of Rights. In addition, a concerned group has developed an initiative which includes education about the issues and building an alliance of community organizations with the objective of pressing those in authority to take responsibility for stopping discrimination against immigrant physicians. And in addition, the Competency Initiative is being developed. Several professionals working from different perspectives have volunteered their time to draft a submission to the medical regulatory authorities, which, 1, reviews the fundamental legal principles of professional regulations and analyzes how the regulation of the medical profession has strayed from these fundamental rules. 2, it enumerates the negative effects of straying from principled regulation, including the perpetuation of prejudice, legitimizing exclusion, and compromising access to and quality of healthcare provided. And thirdly, it makes recommendations. It is true that these measures alone will not address the conscious and unconscious prejudice against IMGs, but it is a start. And the second step will be to require a multifaceted approach where policies driven by institutions who are trying to further their own interests are checked. And IMGs are given a voice at the tables where decisions that affect their access to licensing are being made. Currently, the tables where these decisions that so negatively impact IMGs, these tables are populated by those whose interests are advanced at the expense of IMGs and at the expense of the public, who faces a compromised standard of healthcare and limited access to physicians. This third step is providing the fairness commissioners, which exist in some province, some teeth to be able to oversee and implement their recommendations. Currently, there isn't a fairness commissioner in this country that has teeth to enforce the recommendations they make. And of course, if it's not advantageous to those in power, those recommendations are ignored and have been ignored. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn the floor over to the audience and ask you all, what can you do? What do you recommend be done? And what questions do you have about this very sad state of affairs?
Thank you very much, Rosemary, for your great presentation and elaboration on the facts and legal implications. I'm going to take the questions and I'm going to ask you. So the first question, thanks for raising this important issue. What can we do as individuals, knowing that various colleges of physicians have big pockets to defend their decisions?
Well, the whole purpose of the Competency Initiative that I spoke of is to go directly to the colleges, the national and the provincial colleges, and make them aware of their shortcomings. But truly, many reports have been written, and although I think this is an important initiative to bring awareness and to educate, because in my dealings with the colleges across Canada, they don't really understand the legal principles by which they're supposed to be operating. And they don't even realize, they kind of wash their hands of responsibility. So I think that one of the things it is important to do is for us to make this alliance, to come together and cry out against the discrimination. Secondly, it's important to get behind this competency initiative, which Vahid will give you the contact information shortly. And secondly, it's important to support the legal proceedings, and particularly the human rights claim, by volunteering to work with that group, and in addition to help support financially. Organizations need, so for those of you in positions of power, we ask that you use your influence to correct this wrong and to make them aware. For those of you who are not, work to bring awareness.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. And the next question is, most IMG spaces go to Canadians who studied abroad, not to immigrant MDs. Will allowing IMGs apply for all residency spaces improve access for immigrants? So, yeah, go ahead.
Deidre, maybe you could take this one.
Oh, sure. I think that, certainly there is a perception out there that Canadians who have studied abroad have a better chance of obtaining residency seats. And I think that there's a number of factors that people are looking at when someone applies for residency. We do find that those who are younger, for example, are more likely to get selected compared to those who may be older. In Alberta, I would say, you know, out of the number of seats that that are available. So for example, you know, family medicine may have, you know, 200 residency seats, and then 15 of those are allocated to IMGs. What we find in Alberta, given the situation that they go through, is that at least 50 or more, you know, in terms of percentage, you know, of immigrant IMGs actually get those residency seats. And this is one of the, I know Rosemary and I have talked about this, because one of the issues with the Canadian residency matching system is that this is a piece of information that we would really like to explore further and have information around with regards to, of those seats based by province, you know, how many of them are going to Canadians who have studied abroad versus immigrant IMGs. What we found is when, you know, when they're kind of put in the same pool, a lot of immigrant IMGs, you know, have fears around competing, you know, against Canadians who have studied abroad. But in reality, when they get to the interview, you know, they have the competence, like Rosemary had indicated, they have the maturity, the years of experience, and they are often selected over some of the Canadians who've studied abroad. And that's what we've seen. But again, this is information that needs to be documented and needs to be made more accessible so that we can, in fact, you know, see what's going on. And again, I think the big question is, in the beginning, there were, you know, we were happy to see, you know, seats being allocated to IMGs, you know, ensuring that they're actually getting, you know, seats. But now, you know, just, you know, the points that Rosemary had made in her presentation, you know, really are, you know, questionable as to, is this the right thing to do? Is it right to limit people, you know, of their choices and their career paths? And so Rosemary, I don't know if you would like to add anything else to that.
Certainly in British Columbia, immigrant physicians have typically dominated the positions that are available for IMGs, although there have been some years where CSAs have got more positions, but for the longest, and some years where they get substantially less or next to none. And unfortunately, the difficulty that I see is that instead of looking at people as individuals with the complete picture of what they can bring to medicine, for licensure in medicine, the culture in medicine seems to promote and propagate prejudices. Whether, you know, our CMGs are clearly superior from in the traditional culture. But when we've seen them compete in the second iteration, that is not true. That immigrant physicians and Canadians who study abroad are able to beat them out. And we really need to get to the point where we're looking at the qualifications of the individual. And immigrant physicians, in my experience, although historically they came to Canada with substantial cultural issues and language issues, and that still exists today to some extent, and that is a barrier to being selected. But more and more, we see immigrant physicians who do not have difficulty with either of those things, with the globalization of the world. And so these two are prejudices that we have to overcome and look at the individual. So my experience when I've tried to discuss the discrimination with those in the position of establishment, they're quick to kind of turn the discussion to CSAs versus immigrant physicians, when really the discussion should be the discrimination that IMGs face in respect to CMGs, and stop the assumption that CMGs are superior and should be licensed regardless of their level of competency.
Well, and I think that that's an excellent point, Rosemary. And I know one of the things when we had the medical communication assessment program, for example, what that demonstrated, there was a 70% success rate of people going through that program and obtaining, either going through the PRA program residency or obtaining jobs as clinical and surgical assistants. So I think that when the supports are there, they demonstrate those competencies and any concerns, at least most do. So I think that, the supports are necessary to help throughout the pathway, and the information is needed earlier as well. And I think one of the points that I was going to ask you if you wanted to talk about is just a little bit about the visa trainees and who they were, because that wasn't something that we really talked about in the presentation. Because in the past, of course, the argument was that there wasn't enough postgraduate trainee positions or preceptors, so to speak. And I didn't know if you wanted to say something about that.
The universities found that they could get, I think the universities across Canada currently take in approximately $100 million in fees by selling positions to what are called visa trainees, foreigners from Gulf state, mostly Saudi Arabia. And there are, in the recent documentation that was released by CAPER, it demonstrated that there were about twice as many visa trainees in postgraduate training than there are Canadians who are IMGs. So the original line was that visa trainees are not filling necessary positions, but when the Saudi government was planning on withdrawing, the universities and the hospitals quickly made an outcry that in fact these visa trainees were doing necessary jobs and stealing away positions, taking positions that would have had to been filled by Canadians. So there's a lot of hanky-panky going on, if I could use that term of art, in terms of how the system is working, because of course the Immigration Act is very clear that jobs, whether they're, and training positions, education, are to be for Canadians first. And that is not the situation at all. And we our society has brought an application to review the exemption of visa trainees from having to undergo a labor market investigation analysis. And that we are not seeing a lot of action on that application for review. But my best estimate is that there would probably be approximately 800 or so visa trainees, but we do not have that. We've done a Freedom of Information request for that information, but we haven't received that. And the others would be in fellowship positions.
Thank you very much, Dieter and Rosemary. We have about, I think, 4 minutes until the end of our workshop. And something that I wanted to add is that we are looking for representation by IMGs in different committees that make a decision about IMGs, either CSAs or immigrant physicians. And so that should be helpful in regard to the question that if we just allow everyone to compete in the same pool. So just let me see if there are other questions. And
while you're looking, Naveed, I'd just like to make a couple of other points. And I had said in answer to the first question that it's necessary, to get on board with the Alliance and the Competence Initiative. And I would really encourage you to contact us on the contact. Vahid had the slide up as to where you can contact us. But it's really, really important because we need to have these organizations cry out, because we are so easily silenced. And truly, there is a lack of awareness and fear. Immigrant physicians are very afraid to speak out because of a fear of retaliation. And if the organizations which support them all come together, we can make a difference. The other thing is that I really want to emphasize, and I mentioned this before, is supporting the human rights case, and financially, but also with work. And one thing that I would ask organizations who care about this issue and who feel that the people that they serve aren't being served well is to consider becoming an intervener in the human rights case. Because if in any human rights case, if the people if the tribunal recognize that this is a national interest matter, and it's not just about these 5 immigrant physicians, the case will be looked more seriously, and there's a higher ability for success, a higher probability of success. I think the case is strong, but I think it would be stronger, and that the public would become more aware, and the process would be set up for government to stop this nonsense of discrimination if there were interveners in the human rights case. Sorry, Vahid, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. So our contact information is up, and I think we took almost all the questions. I am going to just repeat the one that we discussed when your internet connection was off. So the question was, what happens to IMGs who don't get residencies? Didn't an individual in Ontario commit suicide a couple of years ago?
Yes, I mean, it's devastating. It's emotionally devastating, and certainly whether one is a CMG or a Canadian who studied abroad or an immigrant physician, we're all people, and we are all cut the same way, and we bleed the same way. And in 2016, where a CMG did not match, there was this tremendous outcry about how devastating and how it eroded your self-worth and how it caused mental illness if you can't proceed in the career that you are trained for. I found that I understand that it's true, but it's very, very distressing that the response was to support CMGs to further exclude IMGs, as if Canadians who are IMGs don't bleed and hurt in the same way. It's devastating, I think, and an attitude and culture that definitely needs correcting.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. And we have reached to the end of our workshop. Thanks everyone for joining. It was a great pleasure having you, and have a great rest of the day.